Hey guys, Jim here with another video for you. This is 50 Years in Film, 2011. But before we begin, at the end of this video, if you like what you see, please consider giving me a thumbs up, a possible subscribe, but most importantly, leave comments below. Let me know how you feel about the films this year, what your favorite films are from this year. Now, before we begin, we're going to start with the normal caveats. These are not all of the films from 2011, far from it. Especially this year. I'll get more into that in a minute. These are simply the films that I own in my collection, currently. There are a couple of extra titles that I do own that I can't find. I hope to find them before we do our rankings, because a couple of them are really good, including Drive. But anyways, we're going to trudge through this, because every decade that I've started this, there's been one year that has just been kind of meh and average at best. In the 80s, it was 83. In the 90s, it was 94. In the aughts, it was 2001. And in the 10s, it's 2011. I've got 20 titles from this year. And, well, we'll get through them when we get through them. But I just wanted to point out that this was a very weak year overall for movies. I call this the year of the remakes, because I own a couple remakes from this year. Again, we'll get into it. But here's some of the remakes that came out theatrically that year that I didn't realize so many came out in such a small period of time. Here we go. Three Musketeers, The Thing, Footloose, The Killer Elite, Straw Dogs, Fright Night, Conan the Barbarian, The Mechanic, Big Mama's Son, or whatever, that's a reboot, Arthur. And then we got a couple of underwhelming superhero movies that I don't own, The Green Lantern and Green Hornet. And then they rebooted The Smurfs and The Muppets. That alone, there's 14 titles right there. So we're just going to trudge through this. This is not going to be a very strong year overall, but there are some good titles here. So we're going to jump around in genre like we always do. We're just going to get this one out of the way right away. From my Harry Potter collection, the final installment, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2, directed by Peter Yates, starring Daniel Radcliffe and the rest of them. Huge hit, great reviews, heard it was a great movie. As always, I have never seen it. Then we're going to switch to comedy. The biggest comedy that year was The Hangover Part 2, directed by Todd Phillips, and starring Bradley Cooper, Ed Helms, and Zach Galifianakis. This is more or less the same exact movie as the first one, but in Thailand, with the gross factor upped a little bit, and is not as good. Funny movie. It's not a classic like the original. Then we have The Change Up, starring Ryan Reynolds, Jason Bateman. This is more or less a version of Freaky Friday. Directed by David Dobkin, who also directed Wedding Crashers. Again, it's a funny movie. It's definitely not a classic of any kind. Then we've got Bad Teacher, starring Cameron Diaz, Justin Timberlake, and Jason Segel. Directed by Jake Kasdan. Again, funny movie. It is. It's a funny movie. But it's not a classic. It's nothing. Most people don't even remember this movie 10 years later, 15 years later. But again, at the time, it was a hit, and it's a funny movie. And then we've got another huge hit from that year, Bridesmaids, starring Kristen Wiig, Rose Byrne, Melissa McCarthy. Great cast in this movie. And this one is directed by Paul Feig, I believe. I don't remember off the top of my head because I'm having a brain fart. But this movie was a big hit. It definitely launched a couple of these ladies into a higher career, especially Melissa McCarthy. This was definitely her big breakout role. And again, Bridesmaids, funny movie. But I think the funniest movie that year was Horrible Bosses, starring Jason Bateman, Charlie Day, Jason Sudeikis, and Kevin Spacey, Colin Farrell with the worst comb over ever, and Jennifer Aston, believe it or not, is the boss from hell. This movie's hilarious. It is really, really funny. The sequel, not so much, but this one is really funny. Directed by Seth Gordon. Yeah, I really like Horrible Bosses. I still think it's a very funny movie. Now we're switching over to drama. Going to start off with the first of the remakes that I own, kind of. Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, starring the incredible Gary Oldman, Colin Firth, Benedict Cumberbatch. It's an all-star cast. And again, this is a remake. I believe if it's not a remake of a movie, it's definitely a remake of a BBC miniseries. And it's based on a novel, of course. Solid movie. Kind of slow, but very well made. Then we've got Red State, written and directed by Kevin Smith, starring John Goodman, Melissa Leo, and Michael Parks in an incredible performance. This is one of those Kevin Smith movies that hardly anybody has ever seen. This is the closest thing to a drama he ever made, / horror movie. At the time, he considered it a horror movie, although he does make a horror movie in a couple of years that we'll get to when we get to. But Red State, it's a really good movie. I don't like the end. I think the ending kind of craps out. But up until that point, it's a really good movie. I don't want to get into the plot too much. Eventually, I am going to do a Kevin Smith video where I get more into his filmography, and I will cover this movie at that time. But again, as it is, this isn't like one of my favorite movies from him, but it is a solid film. And then we've got Limitless, starring Bradley Cooper, Abby Cornish, and Robert De Niro. This movie's entertaining as hell. It's crazy. I don't know how believable it is, but it's a really cool movie. Who directed this? I forget. Neil Berger. Don't know who he is, but this is a really fun movie. And again, this is a movie, it was kind of a sleeper hit at the time. It has kind of been forgotten over the last 15 years. And I might cover this one on one of my own forgotten film series. Because again, this movie's a lot of fun. Then we've got the other remake that I own. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Directed by David Fincher and starring Rooney Mara, Daniel Craig, and Stellan Skarsgård. This is a remake of the Swedish film, of course, that I hold very dear to my heart. That was my #1 movie from 2009. This one's very good as well. I like this movie a lot. I don't like it as much as the original. But again, for a Hollywood version of that film, it's done extremely well, as most David Fincher movies are. And Rooney Mara, again, she's not as good as Noomi Rapace, but she throws herself into this role well, as does Daniel Craig. The two of them, very good in this movie. Stellan Skarsgård, to me, though, is the standout in this movie. But again, for a remake of a movie that I really love, this one's pretty good. Now we're going to switch into action. We're going to start off with probably the weirdest movie of the year, Sucker Punch. Directed by Zack Snyder. Starring Jon Hamm, Carla Gugino, Abby Cornish, and I forget her name now, the main star. She was in American Gods in my brain. Emily Browning. I'm sorry. Oh, Scott Glenn's in this movie too. This is a weird movie, man. I've seen it several times, and I admire things about it, but I still can't really say if I like it or not. I mean, it's a visually arresting movie. It's got some great music in it, but it plays like a series of music videos. And the story, I can't really attach myself to. This movie's like a lot of Zack Snyder movies. It looks pretty, but there's really not a lot of substance there. But again, it's not horrible, and I've seen it more than once, so obviously I don't hate this movie. It's just weird. Then we're going to switch into the comic book genre or superhero genre, and we got 3 of them this year. The first was Captain America, the First Avenger, starring Chris Evans, Hugo Weaving, and what's her name? Oh, well, Tommy Lee Jones, of course. But Haley Atwell, I'm sorry, is Peggy Carter. And this movie was directed by Rob Johnson. This was, of course, the introduction to Captain America. Chris Evans as Captain America, more specifically. And I like this movie. I don't like it as much as the other Captain America movies, to be honest. But for an origin one and a superhero movie, this one's probably the most grounded out of all of them. This kind of plays like an old-fashioned World War II movie. And I've always enjoyed this movie. I think Chris Evans is really good in the role. And Hugo Weaving is a little bit underused as the Red Skull, but other than that, solid superhero film. The other origin MCU movie that year was Thor, starring Chris Hemsworth, Natalie Portman, Idris Elba, and then Anthony Hopkins. Directed by Kenneth Branagh, of all people. And it actually kind of makes sense because there is a lot of Hamlet, Shakespearean type stuff going on in this movie. But yeah, this movie, again, for a debut film, it's a lot of fun. This was probably most people's introduction to Chris Hemsworth, and he's perfect as Thor. Again, it's not my favorite Thor movie, but it's certainly not my not my least favorite. And we'll get into those as we get into them. But again, for an origin story, it's a solid movie. And to me, not only did this was the big introduction to Thor, but of course, Loki. He's been around just as long as Thor has. So yeah, Thor's a good movie. And the other Marvel property, but it was Fox at the time, from my X-Men box set, more specifically the X-Men Beginnings trilogy, we have X-Men First Class, directed by Matthew Vaughn and starring James McAvoy, Michael Fassbender, Jennifer Lawrence, so many others, and Kevin Bacon is the big bad in this movie. This was the reboot of the X-Men series with the younger actors, and again, like for an origin story, it's great. It's much better than the original X-Men movie, I think. And it's certainly better than the third X-Men movie. Still not as good as X2. But as it is, this was a really good introduction to the new characters. And yeah, solid film. Okay, and then we're going into more action. And we have, from my Mission Impossible 4 film set, the last installment in that box set, Ghost Protocol, directed by Brad Bird, who directed The Incredibles, and starring Tom Cruise, Ving Rhames, Jeremy Renner, and Simon Pegg. The 2 of them definitely take a prominent role in this movie. This movie's fun. I like this one better than the 3 movies that came out before it. This movie is just a lot of fun. Again, plot is convoluted as hell, sometimes hard to follow. You don't watch these movies for that. You watch this movie for the action set pieces, and in this case, the chemistry between the actors. Again, Ghost Protocol, it's a lot of fun. Now we're switching over into sci-fi. We're starting off with Cowboys vs. Aliens. Undoubtedly one of the weirdest movies of that year. Directed by Jon Favreau and starring Daniel Craig, Harrison Ford, and what the hell is her? Olivia Wilde, I'm sorry. Entertaining movie. Dumb as hell. Then we have Battle Los Angeles, starring Aaron Eckhart and Michelle Rodriguez. Directed by Jonathan Liebman. I saw this movie theatrically. I remember being underwhelmed by it. I have not seen it since. I have this because I literally picked this up today, of all of all days, at the Goodwill store for $1.50. I figured it was worth another shot. And to be honest, I needed a couple of titles to pad my list for this underwhelming year. This one flew under the radar, and this one's pretty awesome. Attack the Block, directed by Joe Cornish and starring Nick Frost and John Boyega from these new Star Wars films. And this was definitely the first time I ever saw him. This movie's a lot of fun. This movie was kind of a sleeper hit in the UK, I guess. It definitely flew under the radar here. I don't even know if it got a theatrical release in the States. I saw this on video. I read about this on Ain't It Cool News back in the day, and rented it and loved it. And this is the first time I've owned it. Again, this is another one that I bought to pad the list for this year, and I'm glad I did. This is a really, really fun movie. Then we've got Source Code, starring Jake Gyllenhaal, Michelle Monaghan, Vera Farmiga. Directed by, God, I'm getting horrible, Duncan Jones. Yeah, I should have remembered that, because Duncan Jones also directed a great movie called Moon that I really like. Also Warcraft, which I haven't seen. This is a really good movie. This is like a science fiction, time travel, love story, action film, suspense drama, all thrown into one. And Gyllenhaal gives a great performance in this movie. And yeah, Source Code, a lot of fun. It's also got I'm not going to get into it. Yeah, a lot of fun. We're going to end it on this one. Another reboot. Without a doubt, the most surprising film of the year for me. Rise of the Planet of the Apes. Starring James Franco, John Lithgow, and Andy Serkis as Caesar. Directed by Rupert Wyatt. I am a huge Planet of the Apes fan. I grew up with the original films. My first memory of seeing any kind of movie theatrically is Battle for the Planet of the Apes in 1973. I went to the drive-in with my family, and I was 6 years old. I don't remember the actual movie, but I do remember going to the drive-in to see that movie. Because of that, I've been a huge Planet of the Apes fan ever since. And we're going to get into a ranking of these films very soon, because this actually tied on my poll. So I'm going to have to run this video whether I like it or not. But that being said, when the Tim Burton movie came out in 2001, I believe, I saw it and I kind of liked it at the time, but the ending infuriated me. And I watched it again when it came out on video, and quite frankly, I didn't like it. And I haven't watched it since. Full disclosure, I just ordered it on DVD because I can't find it on Blu-ray for under $100. And I will be getting that one in sometime this week. When I do, I will own all of the Planet of the Apes movies, and we will do the ranking at that point. However, I'm babbling. I had very low expectations to see this movie. I actually didn't want to see it at all. And my wife and my mom wanted to see it. And me and my wife were dating at the time. So the three of us did. I went in begrudgingly. And I absolutely love this film. It's an incredible movie. And it's an awesome opening chapter to what I think is one of the greatest modern day trilogies. It's the new trilogy of the Planet of the Apes does what all reboots or remakes should do. They take that general genesis of the idea and they expand on it in different ways that don't become something that predictable, that this movie actually lets their audience come up with the right conclusions at the right time. And I love this movie. The performances are great. The story's great. The effects are still great. But Andy Serkis, I thought he did such an incredible job as Gollum. But the man should have won an Oscar for his 3 performances as Caesar, even if it was a special honorary Oscar, because the work he does in these 3 movies is absolutely incredible. Again, I can't stress enough how much I enjoy this movie. I was shocked at the quality involved. And it is. It's a great way for that trilogy to begin. And it's a great way to end this very underwhelming film in years in film. But I hope you did enjoy this video. And if you did, please, again, give me a thumbs up, a possible subscribe, and leave those comments below. I would really love to hear from you. We are going to throw a couple other videos this week in addition to the next installment. And we'll see what else we got up our sleeves for this week. But until then, I hope everybody has a great one.